really blown back against Europe and are pummeling the working class, the ordinary folks who are trying to pay their energy bills and their grocery bills. And that is causing a lot of problems in Europe, where we see the discontent not only in street demonstrations, but also in some of the elections that have been happening, where politicians are being put on the line to see where they stand on this issue. And meanwhile, American companies are laughing all the way to the bank, whether they're the energy companies who are now replacing the Russians with energy prices that are 4 times what the Russians were charging and 4 times what we're paying here in the United States. Or it's the weapon company who are not only getting rich off of what the US is sending to Ukraine, but finally getting a lot of the European countries to spend more on their military, something that the US has been trying to do for years. And spending more means buying more weapons from the US. So I agree with your premise, which is to say that it's the Americans who are a small sector of the Americans. It's not the American people, it's American companies who are gaining from this, especially the weapons and the dirty energy companies.
That's correct. And also the military industrial complex and everything apart from that as well. And you're right. And all of these weapons they're sending to Ukraine, everything needs to be replaced, and they're being replaced by NATO weapons and obviously US weapons as well. And it's just a really big moneymaker for them.
Yes, I just want to point out there that here in the US, it's used as an excuse, is we have to replenish what the Pentagon has sent. But we just did an article showing that they are calling for the purchase of way more weapons than they've actually sent. And it's become a justification for changing even the way that the weapons are the contracts are made, calling for long-term contracts that can go for years from today, whether or not the war continues that long, calling for less congressional oversight over the contracting. So this is really an incredible boon for the weapons industry, and as you said, for the military-industrial complex. And one thing to point out is if this war ends without us going into a nuclear war, there is the issue of rebuilding Ukraine. And already we know that the big contractors are starting to lick their chops and think of how much money is there to be made from the many, many hundreds of billions, if not going into the trillions of dollars it will take to rebuild Ukraine.
That's right. Yeah, I completely agree with you. So how long do you think Zelensky will last then? There has been more. Biden has just agreed for more money to be sent to Ukraine, I believe yesterday or the day before, and there's also another figure they're talking about, 40 to 50 billion. And overall, it's going to go well over 100 billion. And how long do you think this is going to last? And how long, is Zelensky going to get all of this support?
Well, the big support is coming from the United States, but there is also support coming from Europe as well. And I think there's more questioning already in Europe about that support. There's more questioning already in Europe about the money that the government's pledged to put into the military as well. And I think that's because there is a more robust discussion in Europe than in the United States. There's more play between the political parties. And there's more of a history of people getting out on the streets over these issues than we have had in recent years in the United States. When it comes to the US, the amount of money to Ukraine is going to be over $100 billion by the end of the year, and that will be in less than 1 year. It's not just the money going to weapons, but the Ukrainians have said they need 1.5 billion, and some have said 2 billion every month to keep their economy going. Yeah. And they are totally dependent on the West, and particularly on the US for that. With the Republicans taking over the House and Congress, starting in January, there's going to be a lot more questioning about that. In the US, we have a two-party system in which both of the parties are pro-war. But when you have a Democrat in the White House, you don't have Democratic opposition to the war. And when you have Republicans controlling one of the houses in the Congress, there's going to be still most of the Republicans voting for more money for war, but there's going to be more of an opposition building up. And that's where we feel in the anti-war movement that we have to take advantage of that, build on that, and really make the members of Congress hear from their constituents that this isn't the way that we want our money going, and that we don't think this is helpful for the Ukrainians in the long run either, because they're the ones who are fighting and dying in this war.
Do the Congress and the leadership in the United States actually care for the Ukrainian people? Because we are seeing casualties, well over hundreds and thousands being killed in the battlefield, not forgetting the hundreds and thousands being injured as well. And plus, there is a huge refugee crisis right now. People don't have any heating, people don't have any hot water. So people are rushing out to the borders, and this is obviously going to affect Europe as well. Do they actually care about Ukrainian people, or do they actually just want their own agenda to be filled?
I don't know. I mean, I think you'd have to look at different politicians to find that out. When it comes to the mindset, though, perhaps they have convinced themselves that this is some kind of fight for democracy, or certainly they've convinced themselves that US hegemony is a good thing for the US and the rest of the world. And they see the world through these glasses of US exceptionalism. And that's a very unfortunate part of politics in the United States. To climb up the ladder of the political parties, you have to buy into that mindset. And we even see a number of progressives who get in, become Congress people, and then over time, they too are thinking about how are they going to become the head of a committee, how are they going to have more power, and so they start buying into this idea that US is a force for good in the world. And then there's also the influence of the lobby groups. And we can't discount that, because that's how the US system runs, on money in politics and where does that money come from. And a lot of it comes from corporations who benefit from this kind of instability in the world. So there are many influences on them, but I think in the end, to continue in a very dirty political system that we have in the United States, you have to convince yourself that you're doing it for some sort of benefit for the good old USA.
Yeah, I just don't understand it, Medea. I just don't understand how what they are thinking about, because surely it's much easier to come to a peace deal with Russia, agree that Ukraine's not going to join NATO, agree uh, with them not bombing Donbass and Luhansk, and it's much easier to go for peace. Instead, they decided to go for war. They're giving all these weapons to Ukraine, pushing for Ukrainians to go and kill themselves. They're bringing on all the Europeans along with them to destroy their own economy with the sanctions. When will when will all this end? What's your thoughts about all this?
When you have a population in Ukraine that's been whipped up to think that they must fight for every inch of territory in their country, and you have the extreme right in Ukraine that has become more empowered with this war, I think it's very hard to convince the Ukrainians to sit down at the peace table. But if the powers that are funding this war decide that they don't want to keep going endlessly with this conflict, then it becomes imperative for the Ukrainians to sit down at the table. So I feel that the impetus for negotiations is going to have to come from the West, where people in Europe just say, we're getting fed up with this. And that is certainly going to happen to a greater extent as winter sets in. And I think in Russia as well, you have to have more of a groundswell from the bottom up of the population saying that this is not good for us either. So it really depends on people putting pressure on governments to start negotiating, and that's where we come in.
But do you think realistically that will happen? I mean, I remember months ago, near the start of the conflict, when Zelensky was talking about a peace deal with Russia, Boris Johnson flew into Ukraine and he decided to talk Zelensky out of it. And now, even to this day, Ukrainians are saying we want Russia to give back every inch of territory, including Crimea. We want Russia to, say apologize to every single lives they want lost that was lost. They want Russia to pay for all of the damages. I mean, they're giving all of these um, impossible targets for negotiation, and the US is still dumping weapons and money into Ukraine. I mean, it doesn't seem like anybody wants peace. I think they just want war, by the sounds of it. What's your
Well,
thoughts?
I think there are different sectors that are coming to the realization that this is leading to a global recession, that this is leading to extreme right forces in different countries, like we saw in Sweden and in Italy coming to power. That many businesses, I mean, let's look at Germany and all of these manufacturers who are going bankrupt because they can't pay the high energy prices. There's resistance coming from different sectors now, and this will grow. Wars do end. We've seen how the U.S. was able to stay in Afghanistan for 20 years, and we certainly don't want to see that happening in this case. I think in this case, because the entire world is affected by it, it's a different story. We have pressure coming from so many different sectors of the globe saying that this is affecting our populations, our stability, our economies, that I do think the pressure is going to grow and this can't keep going on for years to come. I don't think the American people will want this to happen. We see a huge difference in the polling between polls that took place in March and polls that are taking place now, asking if the US is doing enough, just right, or too much for Ukraine. And in the Republican Party, it's now clearly the majority of people who say we're doing too much. That's a significant break in the dike. And I think, as this does affect people's pocketbooks, are going to see more resistance. And when Ukraine can't get this level of support, not only for military aid, but for the economy that has been devastated by this war, then you're going to have, you will hear a different story about their willingness to go back to where they were, the positions when those negotiations you were mentioning were taking place in March and April, where there was a much more conciliatory kind of view and a recognition that Ukraine had to be neutral, a recognition that they were going to have to compromise when it came to territory. So I think that we are moving in that direction. And when we saw the missile that landed in Poland and how Zelensky was so quick to blame it on the Russians in his desire to get the West directly involved in this war, and how you saw the immediate pushback coming from the United States and NATO saying, no, 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 this didn't come from Russia, and a division then with how they were talking versus how Zelensky was talking. I think this shows how the West does not want to get directly involved, does not want this war to spread. And this is an opening to say that if you don't want to see this taking us to World War III or a nuclear war, then negotiations is the only way.
Yeah, I like to kind of pleasantly disagree with you because I mean, I don't see it from the European side. I mean, yesterday Ursula came up and said that they stand with Ukraine until, however long it lasts. The Poland Prime Minister came out today, said they're going to support Ukraine as long as it lasts. The same with Macron and the Green Party in Germany. And apart from Italy and Sweden, like you say, everybody else is still gun ho. And you got Finland joining NATO and Sweden also joining NATO. Things it seems to me that they are escalating day by day. And obviously during the G20, you've seen a missile, Ukrainian missile, which went into Poland, and all the world leaders were asking for Article 5. They were running around like headless chickens. Nobody was blaming Ukraine. Everyone was blaming Russia, and they were all, they all phoning each other, seeing what steps to take. I mean, I don't see it, Medea. I mean, I just,
Well, I
yeah,
will pleasantly disagree with you,
yeah,
because I do see that there are protests that are happening in many parts of Europe around inflation, and they are connecting the issue of inflation to the issue of Ukraine. As you said, the refugee crisis, with people in Ukraine not having water, electricity, and heating, and the head of the electricity companies saying it would be good if people actually could leave Ukraine now, at least for a couple of months. That means another wave of refugees that's not going to sit well in the European countries, where people feel they have been saturated already. And I recently was reading about the arguments that some of the Europeans are having with the US over these high energy prices, and this recognition that the US is pretty much unscathed during this conflict, while they are feeling the
yeah.
repercussions. So I don't think this can continue to go on for very long without it blowing up in divisions among the Europeans. And there's already divisions between those in the Baltic states and Poland, the countries that are more anti-Russian, and those who have wanted to continue to have discussions with Putin. So that cannot. NATO came together so quickly when this war began, and we're one big happy family, and we're going to all come together and now add Finland and Sweden in, and we're going to defeat the Russians. I don't think that big happy family exists anymore.
Yeah, thanks, Vandia. And also, you mentioned Afghanistan, and I remember the time when Biden said, "Oh, we stand with Afghanistan people, we stand with Afghanistan," and then suddenly, a few months later, the Afghan president came to the White House, and he was telling Biden that, "Oh, we got a problem. The Taliban's going to take over Afghanistan if we don't get more money." And Biden was like, "No, you can't say that to them." To all of the press, you have to say everything is good, everything is fine. So he made he made the Afghan president say everything was fine. Then Biden, a few months later, said, "Oh, there is no way these Taliban's going to take over Afghanistan. Not over my watch." And then what do you know? A few days later, the Taliban took over all of Afghanistan, and Biden promised the people that he's not going to leave them, and that's what he's done. He just left Afghanistan behind. And also the fact that he promised the American people that one of the reasons he's leaving Afghanistan is because there's too much money going into it. However, since Afghanistan, the military budget has gone up, and also there's more money going into Ukraine, and and people are talking about well over 1 trillion if you count the inflation over the next year. Of the military budget's going to go up. Plus, money they're sending to Ukraine is not part of that. What do you feel about all of these, all that's happening, and how they treated Afghanistan as well? What's your thoughts about this?
Well, in Afghanistan, it's even worse than you said, because not only did they pull out and the Taliban took over again, But the $7 billion, which for the Afghan economy was the basis of having a functioning economy and a functioning central bank, that money was being parked in the United States. U.S. telling the Afghan government for 20 years that the safest way to keep your money is to put it in the U.S. Federal Reserve, as well as a couple of places in Europe, including Switzerland. And then when the U.S. Leaves, they freeze the money and don't even allow the central bank to have enough money to have any kind of stability, and not even allowing people who put their money in these Afghan banks, the businesses, to be able to get their money back. So it's so shameful what the U.S. has done to Afghanistan and all of NATO. Let's face it, it wasn't just the United States. And so I think, if we want to relate this to what's happening in Ukraine, you can't believe anything that these Western governments say. Now, it is different because Ukraine is right in Europe, and having this conflict on European soil with the desire of most European governments, and particularly the US, to weaken Russia, it's a bit of a different story. But I think it does go back to the fundamental issue of not of how this is all political, and when it becomes unbearable politically to keep a war going, then the change happens, and the NATO countries can pull out.
Yeah, I just can't believe the Ukrainians who completely have forgotten what's happened to Afghanistan. And the US has got a very much, it's all about their own interests. And as soon as, they stop, as soon as the money runs out, they'll stop caring about you. And as soon as something else will come into fashion next week, like Taiwan or something else. And
Absolutely. And then we won't hear about it in the media anymore. And the American people, if they ever did care about it, won't care about it anymore. And I think you're totally right. I mean, as soon as the pullout from Afghanistan happened, and we were expecting that our efforts to decrease the US Pentagon budget were going to have some success, then immediately there was this war in Ukraine. And as part of this war in Ukraine is to weaken Russia, that is to be able to totally focus on China as the enemy. So until we bring this military industrial complex, rein it in, we will keep having adversaries and wars and justifications for spending this enormous amount of money on weapons.
That's right. I mean, I remember growing up and everybody was saying Saddam is the next Hitler. Then from Saddam, it became Gaddafi. Then from Gaddafi, it became Assad. And they're all painting them all like all of these Hitlers. And now it's obviously Putin. And tomorrow it's going to be President Xi. What do you feel about all of these ridiculous accusations and making these world leaders to be evil, especially when they don't toe the line?
Well, it makes everything so easy when you just paint this one person as the problem and so demonize that person. It makes it easy to convince people that we have to go in and fight, and it makes it easy to convince people that there's no possibilities of negotiating, because how can you negotiate with these evil people? And then to bring it always back to Hitler, well, you couldn't negotiate with Hitler. Look how it turned out for those who tried. So it's a very simplistic way of convincing people that there is no alternative but a, quote, military solution. Yet on the other hand, here in the United States, we have the top military advisor to our president, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, who is saying publicly that there will be no victory in the battlefield, and that it would be good to seize the moment and go for negotiations. So we're starting to have very mixed messages here. One is that Putin is this monster and you can't talk to him. And the other is that there's no winning in the battlefield, so you might as well sit down at the table.
Exactly, Medea. And only people that I see closely resembling Hitler and his ideology is the AZ